Hey everyone, welcome back to another College Chats podcast. Well, on this episode, we are at the business end of the football schedule, and it's fair to say college football is in chaos, and that's what we're going to talk about on this episode. We're going to talk about the complete chaos as the last few weeks of the schedule unfold, and we start to get a bit much clearer picture of what the playoffs are going to look like. But first, we are the College Chaps. I am joined by my other two esteemed colleagues. How are you both?
Doing really well. Doing really well. I actually think, George, you've overestimated the college football season because I don't think we do have a better understanding of how the college football playoff is going to unravel in front of our eyes, even with like 3 weeks left of the regular season. The most chaotic season I think we could all agree we've ever seen, and still those teams and conversations. You don't have to go on social media, right? Like no one seems to know or have a real consensus of opinion of who is good in college football right now, and we're 3 weeks from the end of the season. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's we're getting down to the business end. I feel good. I feel better than a mate of mine who's just texted into our group chat that he's stuck on the Elizabeth line because someone has thrown a shopping trolley onto the tracks in what might
Oh,
be the weirdest train delay that I've ever heard of. Speaking of weird, there's been some weird results. There's some weird games coming up. College football. Let's go.
Well, that's why we love it. That is why we love it. And if it was, you and I were speaking earlier, Alex, if it was dull and boring, it would be the NFL. So there you go. Uh, let's uh, let's kick off, right? There were some big games last weekend, but let's start at the AAC. Not Alex Chinnery. How important, because we've been keeping a close eye, or certainly Oliver has been keeping a very close eye, but I think in general, and keeping a close eye on what's happening there. We were infatuated by the prospect of Navy and Army careering towards a matchup at the end of the year. Still going to happen, but it's maybe not quite as romantic as I wanted it to be. But this weekend, Tulane and Navy play, and Ollie, that's shaping up to be a very important game on a couple of levels, isn't it?
yeah, for sure. And I think the thing is with this game is Navy's defeat to Rice kind of takes away a little bit of the luster of this game that basically had been earmarked on once Navy went on a bit of a winning run. It was this game that was earmarked. You know, the Notre Dame game was clearly a big game for them, but it was never going to really impact them as far as the AAC was concerned. Maybe in terms of how the college football selection committee viewed their resume as a potential contender for a highest ranked conference champion if it ever got to that point. And it was this game that really would determine whether it got to that point or not. But the Rice loss really does impact this game. And more so now, I think this game is super important for Tulane. It's going to be a game that is it's going to have plenty of outside attention because the Green Wave have broke into the top 25 this week and they're just behind Army in the rankings. And it's the first time really that it's felt like Army was challenged, whether it's in the AP poll, whether it was the coaches poll. There hasn't been a team in the AAC really that's felt like being close to Army. And now Tulane, all of a sudden, with 3 weeks left of the regular season to play, is there. They're in the conversation. They're knocking on the door, and people are starting to realize that this Tulane team that was kind of written off when they lost to Oklahoma and Kansas State has actually been as legit in the AAC as it has ever been. You know, they've blown by everyone they've played pretty much in the AAC this year. So they're going to get to display that. I think the game's on ESPN too, so he's going to have plenty of attention on the game. And with Army on a bye week, this is really the game in the AAC that everyone's going to be focusing on. Tulane wins, and it's Tulane Army in the AAC Championship game.
But if you look forward and you'll tell me how this affects, right? Because Army have still got to play Notre Dame, haven't they? They play them week after or next weekend, yeah. So how
Yeah,
does that come into play then?
I mean that game obviously impacts how they're viewed from a college football playoff perspective. Um, that's their biggest game of the season without a doubt. Tulane's played their biggest games. They lost to Oklahoma. They lost to Kansas State. If Army gets blown out off the doors blown off them by Notre Dame, like Navy did, then I think that clearly will put Tulane above them in the college football playoff ranking.
Yeah.
And this is kind of, I think, one of the big arguments that's out there. If you pay any attention to social media, one of the big arguments right now is, yes, Tulane lost to Oklahoma and Kansas State. They're a two-loss team that didn't really compete in those games for most people's opinion, and they don't really deserve to be in that conversation. I think a lot of people feel like, but they're not the same team that lost those games at the end of the day. Yes, it's not an Oklahoma team that's gone on and pushed on to be one of the best in the SEC, so it kind of dilutes the quality loss that people talk about when referring to Group of Five. Obviously, Boise State right there because they played Oregon so close. That really is a quality loss because Oregon's now the number one ranked team in the country. But so Oklahoma and Kansas State, those losses don't look as valuable, which sounds like a ridiculous thing to say. But they just don't. So I think if Army is absolutely shellacked by Notre Dame, I think you'll see a flip of those rankings in the weeks to come, and that puts Tulane in the pound seat going into the AAC Championship game the weekend that the final rankings are released. I just think those two right now, they're just a little bit behind Boise. They're quite a bit behind Boise State, and that's going to be the interesting thing. Is I said it before the rankings were revealed this week. How high is Army? How high is Tulane? Because the first set of rankings, there was a real disparity, and that's still there. That cushion between Boise State and everyone else in the Group of Five level is still there. So it's going to be really interesting to see how that conversation pans out over the next few weeks.
Yeah, I mean, I don't mean to speak out of turn to you here, Ollie, but I think what you've almost just garbled on about there with Army and Tulane's almost a little bit pointless in the CFP discussion, because is Boise going to lose any of its last three games? Probably not, looking at their schedule. So they're going to be in there. They're miles ahead. Even if they lose a game, they still will probably get in as the Group of Five team, right?
Well, I think it's interesting because obviously the loss to Nevada, the win over Nevada was very, very close, and that clearly had an impact on how the College Football Playoff Committee viewed Boise State, because their excuse me, they had teams around them that you would have expected Boise to kind of hold station, but they dropped a spot this week compared to the previous week. And it doesn't impact them in terms of where they actually rank as the highest placed group of, fifth highest placed conference champion. Doesn't impact that conversation at all, but it clearly impacted how the College Football Selection Committee viewed them. So they have another couple of results like that. The Mountain West isn't a foregone conclusion for Boise State, I don't think. That game with UNLV was very close. We've talked endless time on this podcast about how difficult it is to beat the same team twice in a season. If UNLV is the opponent in the Mountain West Championship, that could be a Boise State team that loses right at the final hurdle. And we've had that conversation how many times on this podcast over the years of how the conference championship games can actually negatively impact a team. And all it takes is Tulane winning the AAC or Army winning the AAC and Boise State falling at that final hurdle, and that is a relevant conversation. But someone's going to have to stop Ashton Janty first.
And listen, we know there has been a lot of. I don't know if necessarily we've had too many upsets this year, but certainly has been a lot of excitement and a lot of interesting games. So, who knows what's going to happen in the last couple of weeks of the season. AC, let's move over to the ACC, right? And I felt Miami had been riding their luck for several weeks, and their luck ran out at the weekend. But that actually really opens things up, because Clemson are still there or thereabouts. But I don't know who thought SMU were going to be at the top of that conference table at the start of the season. Certainly not me. But that makes the ACC very interesting now, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I think SMU coming in, it's refreshing. Obviously they've got some big games coming up in this conference. They've got some big games coming up to finish the year. I know they'll be quaking in their boots about playing Boston College in the weeks coming up. But it would be great if they can be in a conference championship game, right? They're fun. They're fun to watch. They play a fun brand of football. It's cool having different teams in and around there, and it sort of shows what we like about this new expanded playoff. If an SMU was to go into the ACC Conference Championship game and win the ACC and make the playoff, that would be awesome. Yeah, a one-loss SMU probably isn't making the playoff in a normal year.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that they're going to have the opportunity to go and be a part of that tournament potentially to compete for a national championship is great. Obviously, to get there, they're going to have to beat some good teams along the way as well. You're probably going to have to beat one of Clemson or Miami or Louisville in that ACC championship game. I think probably it's a step too far for Louisville because they've got 2 losses in conference. But looking at it, it's going to be really interesting to see how these last couple of games go. You'd expect Miami to come out and win their final 2 games after this week against Wake Forest and against Syracuse. But that Syracuse team is not a bad football team either, right? I know they lost this last weekend, but they're still a decent football team at 6-3. You look at Clemson, they've got to play Pitt as their last game in conference again, which is an okay football team, but isn't. Yeah, they're 7-2, but are they really going to push Clemson here? And then after this weekend, Clemson has their season almost wrapped up in terms of where they're at. They can fully focus on resting for an ACC championship game if they beat Pittsburgh in their next game, because their final 2 games aren't in conference. So yeah, there's loads of potential outcomes here that are interesting. And I think that is really just because of the playoff. Because otherwise we wouldn't be interested in a one-loss ACC champion last year. Yeah, an undefeated ACC champion last year didn't make the playoff. So we wouldn't be interested in a one-loss ACC champion in a normal year. And that I think is really interesting and something I'm looking forward to seeing over these next couple of weeks.
For Clemson, it makes that last game against South Carolina intriguing for all the points that Alex has just made, right? I mean, that traditionally that is a rivalry game. That's a game that everyone looks forward to on the calendar. That's a game, if you're undefeated, you can't afford to lose. But actually, it's now really kind of spun on its head a little bit, right? I mean, if you think your hope of getting into the college football playoff is to win the ACC, then that game doesn't matter. It does if you're trying to get into the rankings and you have a heavy defeat, right? So it's a really interesting scenario that plays out, to be perfectly honest.
Yeah, I think that game's bigger for South Carolina, to be honest, because I think Clemson, it's kind of out of their hands whether they get to the ACC championship game or not, because of the tiebreak situations in the ACC. It's kind of if SMU and Miami win out, it's going to be those guys that are in the pound seat for the ACC championship game. But for South Carolina, that at-large bid almost feels, rightly or wrongly, like it's closer to their reach than it is for Clemson's. So I think that game is huge for Shane Beamer's team, that season-ending game, probably more so than for Dabo Swinney and for Clemson.
And a team that's really come on to form at this point in the second half of the season, they really have come onto a game, look very physical in the way they play football. That brings us nicely to the SEC. Last weekend was huge on a couple of fronts, right? The Alabama LSU game was really billed as a winner takes all kind of thing. I certainly didn't see it being the one-sided game that it turned out to be. That's for sure. Not in Death Valley. And I think Brian Kelly's a little shell shocked this week, to be perfectly honest. But for me, the more intriguing game, and I said this last week, was Ole Miss and Georgia, and that means Ole Miss are right back in this now, aren't they?
Yeah, absolutely. I think they're favourite now, really, to push on, and with their remaining schedule, they're favourites to push on, win out, and be the real force behind Texas and Tennessee. And from the SEC's perspective, from the college football playoff is concerned, they've righted the wrongs of previous Ole Miss teams. I think that's the key thing. When you watch that game against Georgia, it was unlike an Ole Miss performance that I can ever remember. And irregardless of who they were playing, whether it was Georgia, whether it was Alabama, whoever the top team in the SEC at the time, Ole Miss has had this habit of just falling apart in those moments defensively. And we've talked about it for years. And the addition of Pete Gold into that staff has been night and day. Lane Kiffin's approach to the transfer portal has really paid off. And I think he talked about it in the aftermath of the Georgia win, talking about how the aftermath of the loss last season, that absolute shellacking that they took, really impacted how they went out and attacked the transfer portal this year. And you could see that through the offseason. You could see with the people that they brought in, and they ended up losing some of those guys as well that they were going to bring in, because they brought in so many like talented defensive players that there just simply wasn't, like, they couldn't catch the checks that their mouths were right in, for want of a better phrase, because there was just too many good guys. But they absolutely dominated Georgia in a way that it made the Georgia offensive line look absolutely, like, I don't know, like FCS level offensive line. They were just the guys like Jared Ivey were just phenomenal and all over the park. And you play like that against any other team in the country, you're going to have success. And it helped that Georgia has got some pretty significant problems, I think, that we're going to touch upon. But don't be under any illusion. Like, that was an incredible Ole Miss performance on Saturday.
Yeah, I think the worst thing for Tennessee that could have happened coming into this game that's coming up was Georgia losing against Ole Miss.
Yeah.
Because it's very rare that you see a Kirby Smart team put two poor performances together in a row. That just doesn't really happen to the University of Georgia Bulldogs with Kirby Smart in charge. So yeah, I think Tennessee is good, but I also think there's a reason that Georgia's a 10-point favorite going into this game right now. And I think that kind of shows you where Vegas thinks they are, where the world of college football thinks both of these two teams are. You know, I like Tennessee. I think they're a good football team. I think they can cause Georgia some issues, but I don't know if they can attack Georgia's weaknesses in the same way that Ole Miss could.
And it's in Athens, right?
And
And
it's in
I think that's a deciding factor, to be honest. If it had been in Neyland, I think maybe you've got the home crowd, you've got the let's call it the kind of quasi playoff scenario, which I spoke to Lane Kiffin this afternoon, and he was unsurprisingly chipper. But he wins a watch this weekend because they're in a bye, right? But if you're going into Neyland, I think Tennessee have got that. But playing in Athens, I think and it's just as you rightly point out, Alex, Kirby Smart does not want to lose two games in the bounds, and of course, so that's what I want to come to. If Georgia win that game, what does that mean for the SEC? Because it is chaos then, isn't it?
Yeah.
So at this point, right, if you're Texas and Texas A&M, you go out and you know that game is essentially a playing game for the SEC Championship game. Yeah, as long as obviously Texas takes care of business in its next two games against Arkansas and Kentucky, which you'd expect them to do. As long as Texas A&M takes care of business against Auburn, which you'd expect them to do. But there's Texas A&M, so all bets are off. It becomes then a playing game essentially to make it in, and Texas knows if they lose because of the tiebreaker situation with Georgia, a two-loss Texas team is probably not making it into the SEC Championship game if Georgia beats Tennessee this weekend. it's a crazy scenario, and I think it's good because you have so many good teams in the SEC. But I think we're going to see a scenario where these championship, the conference championship elements also begin to grow, right? If winning a conference championship gets you a spot in the college football playoff, and you have a situation like this where you could have 4 2-loss teams that are all eligible, and the reason that one makes it over another is because 3 months ago that team beat one of the teams. How close do we feel like we are to actually let's just have conference semi-finals and then conference finals, and then we'll go into the college football playoff, and then does the playoff then become a regionalized there's so much that could potentially happen here. There's we thought, or people thought, that controversy would be going away with this new college football playoff, but the idea that controversy is ever going to leave college football is hilarious to me. And I love it. I love the chaos. I love the intricacies of it all. It makes the season worthwhile.
Just quickly before we leave the SEC, I wanted to ask you both a question about the quarterback position at Georgia. We have talked at length over the last few years about the Georgia quarterback situation. Does Kirby Smart have a blind spot for quarterbacks? Because we are only a couple of games away from the end of the season, to be fair, right? But he will not shift from Carson Beck. 2 schools of thought here. One is that his O-line is just very weak and not giving him any protection. And there's another school of thought, which is Carson Beck has really fallen off a cliff. What do you think?
Yeah, I think, I've been saying this for a while. Carson Beck is a great quarterback when everything's going his way. But the kid really struggles with pressure. And whether that is actual physical pressure, whether that's a defensive lineman flying off the edge and hitting him in the face, or a big defensive tackle coming up the middle, he struggles mightily to handle the physical pressure. And then there's the mental pressure. I think you saw that in the first half against Alabama. And we've talked about this in the podcast. Kid looked shell-shocked. He like rabbit in the headlights. Like, the pressure of that game got to Carson Beck and he couldn't handle it. And I think, that's clearly an issue for Kirby Smart this season and last season as well. He got kind of a flipped situation at the quarterback position because you had a kid in Stetson Bennett who didn't have the physical tools that Carson Beck has. But when you put Stetson Bennett under pressure, like he performed. Like the college football playoff semi-final against Ohio State 2 years ago, like, everyone ruled out Georgia. They were down by, I can't remember off the top of my head how far they were down by, and you thought, well, Stetson Bennett's, he's not the guy to drag him back into there. What did Stetson Bennett do? He just proved everyone wrong. And when the pressure was at its greatest, that's when Stetson Bennett was at his greatest. And you don't have that with Carson Beck. You have a quarterback who's got all the physical tools. In a lot of respects, he's got a lot of what you want between the ears from a quarterback position. But under pressure, he crumbles. And whether it's physical or mental pressure, that's really costing Georgia this season. You've seen it in multiple games. You saw against Ole Miss, it was the physical pressure. They managed to hit him just play after play after play. They were able to get in the backfield and pressure him. And like we said, the Alabama game, that first half, the mental pressure. And as you get to a game like the Tennessee game, because I think Tennessee is going to be able to put him under pressure. Maybe not the same way that Ole Miss did, but they've got some great defensive players. Guys like James Pierce, who's been touted as one of the best defensive players in the 2025 NFL draft class. Like, they are going to be able to pressure him. And if Carson Beck doesn't stand up to that early in that game, I think that's when Georgia are going to have a problem, because Tennessee's got one of the best rushing offenses in the nation. They want to get hold of that ball, run down some clock, get Dylan Sampson in the end zone. Like, Georgia is going to have a problem in that game. And Kirby Smart, it all comes back to the quarterback position.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with a lot of what Ollie said there. And I think, coming back to your point about does Kirby Smart have a quarterback problem, I think in a lot of ways, America has a bit of a quarterback problem right now and a quarterback development problem. I saw a thing on Twitter, a conversation on Twitter the other day about people saying, and I am going to talk about the forbidden part of football, the NFL, saying the NFL's never had better quarterback play than it has right now, which I think is bollocks. They've never had more athletic quarterback play than they have right now. But you're not telling me that this current crop of quarterbacks is as good as Roethlisberger, Rodgers, Brady, Rivers, Breeze when they were all in their pomp and we had real thinkers at the quarterback position. And I think that's one of the issues we have right now in college football is there aren't those thinkers at the top of the college game in the same way that there once was. We've seen a real trend towards uber athletic quarterbacks, and because you have to compete, and coaches thinking, I can teach the skills, I can teach the ability to play QB. But I think what we're seeing this across sports, right? And it's not just in football. We have a big trend of it going on right now in my sport, in volleyball, with the setter position, which is very, very similar, where coaches are trying to get the best athletes they can, put them into this position that's very heavily about thinking, about running a game and game planning and setting up your teammates, and they're overlooking the ability to think and to run a game plan and to be able to execute under pressure. And I think you're seeing that with Georgia football and some of the choices that they've made at the quarterback position. Some of the best Georgia teams that we've seen have had unathletic quarterbacks, and we've slammed them for it on this podcast. And yet they've been really successful because those quarterbacks have been able to run a game plan, have been able under pressure to go out there and execute on the simple throws that win you football matches when you're Georgia and you've got that much talent on your team. And like Ollie says, if they get into a slug match with this Tennessee team, if Tennessee gets up 10 points in this game, it's done. Because Tennessee will just control the ball, they'll control the clock, and they won't let Georgia get back into this game. And Georgia, Carson Beck has to come out and make good, simple decisions early on in this one. And if he doesn't, it's going to be a real struggle for them to come back into this game. And I just don't know whether Kirby Smart is that good or his staff are that good, or whether college football as a whole is that good at developing these guys to be able to play under pressure, to be able to think under pressure, to be able to make good decisions and and play the game the way it needs to be played at the top level.
I mean, you could argue, I don't feel the need to jump into Carson Beck's defence, but he doesn't have anywhere near the targets that his predecessors had. Brock Bowers is away. I'm sure all he can, but you might struggle to name a decent wideout that Georgia have employed this season, right? They have been missing in action.
And yeah, maybe that's part of it. And this idea, athletes don't drop off a cliff, right? Athletic ability doesn't wildly vary, but confidence massively does. Focus massively does. They're the two sort of big things: confidence and focus. And I don't think you get to the level of athlete that Carson Beck is without a decent level of focus on what's going on. Didn't love the images at the end of that Ole Miss game, seeing him there laughing and joking. I don't care what mental model you use as an athlete when your team loses. Like if the camera's on you and there's people relying on you, you've got to be able to fake that and be quite stoic and be quite serious. But I do wonder if not having those wideouts there that he can rely on, not having people that he can rely on in his team to help him, probably makes him feel very lonely, probably makes him feel like the weight of that program is on him right now. And if he's not playing very well, that's just going to hurt his confidence over and over again. And when you start to play with a lack of confidence, especially at this level where the margins are so razor thin because everyone's a phenomenal athlete, every team has got good players, good athletes, especially in the SEC. You can't afford to play on the back foot. You have to play on the front foot. And if he's lost some of that confidence, Georgia's going to struggle because you just can't live out there at this level not being confident in your ability and confident in your team.
Just quickly before we go, I wanted to touch on the rankings which came out last night. I'm not sure if you want to have your say about what you think about the rankings, but my question really is, who should be feeling vulnerable at this moment in time? Who should be feeling uneasy about the rankings that came out last night? And I appreciate they're just the second round, so we still got a few to go. But who's sitting a little uneasy in their seat just now?
Well, I'll tell you what I think about the rankings. I
Go on, Ollie.
honestly, and we give George a lot of stick on this podcast about his SEC bias, but I don't think it made anyone in the world of college football thinks that Georgia dropping by more positions than Miami did on the latest rankings made any sense in the world whatsoever. Like they bumped Ole Miss up to excuse me to a playoff spot, so that told them what they think about Ole Miss. Um, but Georgia to drop as many as they did when Miami didn't didn't drop, like those two swapping places in the rankings to me was bizarre. And you touched on it at the start of the show, George. Like Miami has played, really has played their luck a lot this season, and I've been a big fan of what Cam Ward has done for Miami. And I said it on Saturday, even when they were losing to Georgia Tech, whenever you've got Cam Ward, you feel like you have a chance of winning, and that is what Miami's rode, and you can only ride that for so long, right? So for me, when I look at the rankings, I think how you drop Georgia further than Miami doesn't make any sense, and then that leads me to who feels uncomfortable, and it's the ACC. Like the ACC should feel uncomfortable because the College Football Playoff Selection Committee have said what they think about SMU with where they're ranking SMU right now. I think SMU wins the ACC championship, and there's a very legitimate chance that they're not the top four conference. But there's a very good chance that if the season plays out how we discussed earlier, where Boise wins out, they win out comfortably, the Mountain West champion is going to be ranked ahead of the ACC champion, and he's going to get a bye. He's going to get a first round bye, and SMU, if they win the championship, the ACC is going to be playing in the first round. I think that's where you have to feel uncomfortable if you're the ACC. After what happened last year with FSU, rightly or wrongly, whatever your take on that is, like for the second year in a row, the College Football Selection Committee has told you what it thinks of your conference. I think that's as uncomfortable as you can be right now for a conference as a whole.
Sounds like it.
Look, I think everyone's uncomfortable at this stage because you're a loss away from a big change in where you're ranked, and yeah, it comes to this crunch time, and I think it comes to this idea of you look at Indiana, you look at Ohio State, like is Indiana for real? And we'll get to see that in the next few weeks. Like, is Ohio State for real as well? Like that's a big thing, and the likelihood is that one of those two teams and Oregon are going to be in the Big Ten championship game. And as we've spoken about, and we said even on this show, the Big Ten championship game, being the team that faces Oregon might be the worst spot you could be in. Um, rather than missing out on the Big Ten championship game, because if you get blown out in that one by the best, even though they're the best team in the country right now, puts you in a tough spot, and it puts the committee in a tough spot with some of these teams. I think it's less of a worry if it's Indiana, right? Because if Indiana's undefeated going into that Big Ten championship game with a win over Ohio State, I think they make it into the playoff because the committee looks at it and goes, "Is this school ever going to make it in again? Possibly not. Like let's make it so that they are actually here." And I think with one loss, I think you'll be really hard done by to miss out with one loss if that one loss is in your conference championship game. As an undefeated team, I think that would cause a lot of controversy. I think for Ohio State, they have to be a little bit nervous of where they're at right now because it will be a game they're expecting to win. And they know that not winning it is going to make them drop massively, right? They have one loss right now, and it's by 1 point to the team above them. So if you come through and you're Ohio State and you win the next 3 games, you're going to go into that conference championship game feeling pretty good about having the ability to reverse that loss that you had, and put yourself in a really, really good spot. So yeah, I think they're one who could feel a little bit jittery right now because the committee and everyone in college football will be expecting them to go 3-0 in the last 3 weeks of the season. But that Indiana game could be quite tough.
I mean, this is where the playoff is going to come into its own, right? I mean, if you look at the bracket as it was last night today, and I appreciate that's now how it's all going to finish, I would relish Ole Miss going to play Penn State. I refuse to believe that Penn State are the fourth best team in the country at this moment in time, but time will tell, and that's the beauty of the playoff and the expanded playoff. Well, we've done that today.
Someone at Penn State knows where the bodies are buried.
Yeah, I think it's absurd, but there you go. That such is life. Then maybe that's for another podcast. That's all from us on this episode. We do like a bit of controversy, and it's been awesome catching up with the two of you. If you liked what I don't know why I stuttered. I say the same thing every week. If you liked what you heard, please subscribe, rate, and review. We'd be your friends for life if you can do that. You can also catch up on the previous episodes, which are on both Apple Podcasts and YouTube. You can also follow us on X and Instagram. Our social media accounts are at College Chaps, and the College Chaps podcast on YouTube. So please give us a follow. Thanks again to Alex and Ollie for the brilliant input. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and well, and catch you all next time.